My name is Mark Brzezinski, and I'm proud to be a longtime FDD supporter and board member. I'm pleased to introduce our next expert panel, which will address how radical Sunni and Shia groups threaten minorities and vulnerable communities in the Middle East. In the past few years, the American public has learned about the cultural, ethnic, and religious complexity of the region. Not only are there Sunnis and Shias, Arabs and Persians, there are also the Kurds, the Copts, the Chaldeans, the Yazidis, the Baha, and many others. Most of these communities now face discrimination, persecution, violence, and outright cleansing. In addition, there is widespread and increasing mistreatment on the basis of gender and sexual orientation in many Middle Eastern countries. In this panel, experts will discuss the situation on the ground and what the US and international community can and should do to protect these groups. Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman is the Kurdistan regional government representative to the US. She previously served as the representative in the UK and comes from a long line of leaders of the Kurdish community. She can, unfortunately, personally speak to the tragedies that minority communities in Iraq have suffered. Her father and brother were tragically killed in suicide bombings in 2004. Tony Badran is a research fellow at FDD focused on Lebanon, Syria, and Hezbollah. He also is an expert on the Syrian government's ties to militant non-state actors and terrorist groups. He has a granular understanding of the players in Syria and Iraq and speaks with authority on their activities, movements, and motivations. The Honorable Irwin Cotler is a member of the Canadian Parliament and former Minister of Justice and former Attorney General of Canada. He's a renowned human rights lawyer, international law expert, and a passionate advocate for justice and democracy. Nelson Mandela and Natan Sharansky are among the prominent figures he has defended, rightfully earning him the title Counsel to the Oppressed and Conscience of the International Community. Brian Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He recently authored a groundbreaking study on the plight of Christians in the Middle East. His study found that, quote, some of the oldest Christian communities in the world are disappearing in the very lands where their faith was born and first took root. The panel will be moderated by FDD Senior Fellow John Hanna. John served in the administrations of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, including in the capacity of Vice President Cheney's National Security Advisor. John was intimately involved in US policy toward Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, among other critical national security issues, and as such, he has a deep understanding of the broad strategic challenges in US foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming these distinguished experts.
Great, well thank you very much, Mark, for that great introduction. I don't get many of those, so they're very welcome wherever they come from when kind words are spoken. Welcome to all of you. Great to see you. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks to FDD for an amazing program, I think. I think it's a timely discussion to be talking about minorities in the Middle East. We are this month, I think, marking the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in Anatolia and Turkey. You would have thought a century later we might have been talking about trend lines in the Middle East of movements toward granting universal citizenship to all the peoples of the region and guaranteeing equal treatment under the law for all citizens regardless of religious and ethnic identity. Unfortunately, we're not close to that, and if anything, we seem to be receding farther from that ideal the past decade, certainly accelerating, intensifying the past several years with the rise of ISIS and other forms of jihadism in the Middle East, to the point where again, as Brian has talked about in his study, actually talking about, in some cases, existential questions about the very ability of these minority populations that have been for if not for centuries, then thousands of years even in some cases, have been a bulwark of tolerance and pluralism in the Middle East. Were there long before, in some cases long before Islam arose to dominate the Middle East. And now at least some of these groups are facing this kind of threat to their very survival. It's worth noting that it wasn't the invasion of Iraq, the collapse of Mosul, the fall of Anbar, and ISIS knocking on the gates of Baghdad that got the United States, got President Obama to order airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq. It was, in fact, the threat to two minority groups in particular, the threat that ISIS posed when it decided to turn against the Kurds and begin to march on their capital in Erbil in northern Iraq. And of course, it was the Yazidis, those people that were stuck on that mountain, that the president helped justify his decision to begin going into Iraq, which at a minimum, I think, is a demonstration of the potential resonance that this issue of intense persecution of religious minorities still has, at least amongst the American public, as a rallying cry. And that particular model of international intervention is not a solution to the problem that minorities in the Middle East face that are under great danger, but it could be potentially one of the an element of the solution that maybe the panel will want to discuss. What I'm going to do is I think I'll start at the end with Madam Representative, who it's a great honor to have here at FDD. When I first got associated with the Kurdish issue, it was 20 years ago, and or more than 20 years ago now, when hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Kurds in northern Iraq were pushed up against those mountains, and Saddam, after the Gulf War, was threatening to finish the job of genocide that he had initiated with the Anfal campaign in the 1980s and the chemical weapons attacks on Halabja. And now when I look at what's happened with Kurdistan over the past two and a half decades, it's quite remarkable. The Kurds still face significant threats from people who mean them great ill. And yet Kurdistan is now not only able to protect itself and has a degree of political control over its own fate, as well as economic control that was unthinkable a couple of decades ago. Kurdistan itself has now become a haven for certain persecuted minorities in the Middle East. I wonder if you can just talk about your perspective as a Kurd, as an official now with the KRG, who is responsible for certain minorities, but as a representative of a people who have suffered, not in the very distant past, that this kind of persecution that some of these other minorities face now and threats that they face. If you can just give us some perspective on the situation as seen from Erbil.
Sure. Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the FDD for inviting me to participate. You mentioned your first brush with the Kurds was in 1991. This was just 3 years after the chemical attack on Halabja, 3 years after the Anfal genocide campaign. In 2013, I was the representative of the KRG in London, and we held an international conference to mark the 25th anniversary of the genocide in Halabja, the Anfal operation, and it was also the 30th anniversary of the disappearance of 8,000 Barzanis as another genocide. People in London were asking me, why do you talk about genocide? It happened 25 years ago. My answer was because we don't feel safe. Even today, we don't feel safe. And unfortunately, in 2014, we were proven right. When ISIS entered Iraq, it took over Mosul. Within a couple of months, it was attacking Sinjar, where I'm originally from. And the Yazidis and the Christian communities were fleeing in hundreds of thousands to Kurdistan region for shelter. And I should say that we thank the US administration for stepping in with airstrikes in August, because this did save the Yazidis. The airdrops on Mount Sinjar saved many, many lives. So we're grateful for that. I think where we are today in Kurdistan, we are sheltering over 1.6 million refugees from Syria and displaced people from Iraq. Among them, of course, are the Yazidis, the Christians, Shia, Sunni, Turkoman, Shabak, Kake, Kurds, Arabs. We're sheltering everybody. Why do people feel safe in Kurdistan? Because we have a culture of tolerance, peaceful coexistence, but we also have enshrined a lot of these things in law and even in our constitution, the Kurdistan constitution. I'll give you some statistics and some examples, if I may. Just on the Yazidi displacement, there are about 600,000 Yazidis in all of Iraq. Currently, about 420,000 of them are sheltering in Kurdistan region. Another 8,000 are in refugee camps in Syria and Turkey. Of the Yazidis, close to 6,000 have been kidnapped, 3,000 women and girls, and by that I mean children as young as 8 and 9, have been kidnapped and sold into slavery. We estimate that about 1,000 children under the age of 10 are being indoctrinated by ISIS, and there's a fear that they could become a future generation of terrorists. More than 2,000 Yazidis have been slaughtered by ISIS, so this is all in a very short period of time. With regards to Christians in Iraq, these are all estimates, but in 2003 we believe there were about 1.4 million Christians in Iraq. Today, we think it's about 250,000, maximum 450,000. The other day, I attended the funeral of the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East. The Assyrian Church of the East has about 10 million followers worldwide. It was created in Iraq. The seat of the church is in Iraq. Today, there are only 50,000 members of this Assyrian Church of the East. That just tells you the scale of the tragedy. We also are sheltering Turkmen. In July, there was a massacre of Shia Turkmen in Bashir village. There was a siege of 13,000 Turkmen in Amirli, and this siege was broken by Kurdish and other Iraqi forces with the support of airstrikes. And about 200 Turkmen women are in ISIS custody. So I think that paints a very clear picture of the threat faced by minorities, religious and ethnic minorities, under ISIS, and the kind of shelter that we can provide them in the Kurdistan region. What I would say is that Kurdistan region needs support. The number of refugees and IDPs is beyond our capability. Our own population is about 5 million. We're sheltering 1.6, 1.7 million people. I would also argue that areas of the Middle East, like Kurdistan, which a friend yesterday who's in the audience today, Catherine Porter, described as a still point. Kurdistan is a still point in a volatile region. Places like Kurdistan should be nurtured, should be supported, whether that means economically, that means in building our democratic institutions, and helping us to continue and to develop our culture of tolerance and openness. I think the more that populations and areas like Kurdistan are supported, the stronger the minorities will feel in being willing to stay in the Middle East. Right now, you talk to many Christians and Yazidis in Kurdistan and Iraq. Even though they feel safe in Kurdistan, they don't want to return to their homes. They don't feel safe from ISIS. And the other very big question for all of us in Iraq, we will push out ISIS. We're already winning against ISIS, and they will go. How do we live together after ISIS? That's the big question facing all of us.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Tony right now, because Tony, you know how, as the ambassador alluded, this is, it's a very complicated picture, and there's so many nuances to this minority question, and even within minority communities, whether Kurdish or Christian or otherwise, there are divisions and different factions, and this may or may not be part of the problem and issue that they face. But I wonder if you, particularly on the Kurdish issue in Syria and in Iraq, if you can talk a little bit about some of these complications and maybe even touching on the Christian issues within Syria that you've studied quite in depth.
Sure. Thanks again, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Before I get into that, I was struck as we were talking about what happened 25 years ago and a little more than that. When there was no ISIS, right? When we're talking about Saddam Hussein campaign against the Kurds, this predates ISIS. This was the secular regime that we sometimes now, or some people today, talk about in reference to the Assad regime as being a better alternative to Assad. But then again, the Assad regime itself has had its own brushes with the Kurds, depopulating them, bringing a sort of an Arabization policy to displace them out of their lands, and so on and so forth. So clearly the problem is much more structural and endemic than just the issue of ISIS. ISIS is the latest manifestation. The Iranian-led militias in the region that are also exacerbating it is the latest manifestation. But the problem clearly goes a lot longer than that. The Christian migration from the Middle East, especially going back to the Lebanese Civil War, is a long-standing issue, and it's certainly not just born yesterday. But sort of that said, the reason why a lot of this stuff is happening is because this is, especially in the Levant. The Levant is a mosaic of all these various groups that have been historically going. And we're talking here millennia, especially the minority groups in the Levant, as opposed to sort of what became later sort of the Sunni Arab predominant group in the region. They have been historically fractured. And this goes across the board, from the Christians to the Kurds. And we have seen this in the dynamics that have played out with the ISIS assault in Iraq most recently. The tensions around Amerli, for instance, when the Peshmerga wanted to go in, and how some people welcomed it, some people didn't necessarily welcome it. We're seeing now an increased tension because the Shiite militias want to contest some of the areas that the Kurds have liberated, and they say, well, you shouldn't really be keeping this. One notorious Shiite militia asset of the Iranians, Qais al-Khazali, whom, by the way, was responsible for the murder of Americans and was under arrest before the Maliki government released him, and he went to Iran immediately after that, just called the Kurds leeches on Iraq. So you see, the issue is not really restricted to ISIS. This is a problem that the Kurds, unfortunately, are going to be facing from a multiplicity of directions. But they also, the Iranians beyond the Shia militias, are seeing opportunities elsewhere, with the Yazidis, for instance. The Yazidis, while a lot of them are now, have fled into are being sheltered by the KRG, there was a lot of also tension after the ISIS assault because they felt that the Peshmerga didn't stand up as well as they should have against the ISIS assault. And so that opened the door for a lot of unsavory actors to seize on this, to try to build their own influence into the KRG, one of them being the PKK, the Kurdish PKK party in Syria that tried to expand into Iraq. And the other is now, most recently, the Iranians. So just the other day, there was a big fuss in the Kurdish regional government when the KDP, the dominant Kurdish party of President Masoud Barzani, arrested the head of the Yazidi protection units, one of the militias that came up after the ISIS assault. Why? Because he was reaching out to the Shiite militias. And so what Barzani is thinking about goes beyond ISIS, as Madam Representative said, that yes, okay, the ISIS is going to be pushed out, but then another challenge is going to come into the region that is going to most certainly pose a threat to the security of the Kurds and their gains in recent years and months. Those tensions within the minority groups betray something that we tend to forget when we talk about minorities, especially when we do it here in the United States. We forget that these are groups that have politics, that are active players, that have their ambitions, that have their calculations, that make their alliances, that make their decisions, some of which are good, some of which are terribly, terribly bad, some of which are terribly misguided, and that will probably end up backfiring on them in the long term. And the most obvious example of a minority that has its own, that's certainly an active player and not one in any good capacity, is the Alawite regime of Bashar al-Assad, for instance. I mean, we talk about the threat to minorities, but often we also forget that in this ongoing regional conflagration, the single most battered of the communities is in fact the Sunni Muslims. I mean, and you have about 200,000 dead in Syria, a majority of whom are Sunni Muslims in this case, and the perpetrator is unfortunately also a minority regime. The other problem that this poses for the United States when we actually start taking these guys' political considerations seriously is that oftentimes they do not necessarily align with Western interests or Western players or pro-Western players. So you see, for instance, the Christians in Lebanon as a result. They're split down the middle with one of them. This is well before anything called ISIS even came on the scene. The movement of Michel Aoun, for instance, in Lebanon, long ago aligned with Hezbollah. After being in the United States, a very vocal pro-US voice went back to Lebanon and allied with Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah. So when we sort of throw blanket categories about minorities or various minority groups, oftentimes this masks all these various dynamics and very real political decisions and choices that are taking place. Just one last example. For instance, in the case of Bashar, relevant to the ISIS question, in the case of Bashar al-Assad and ISIS, you all probably heard the story about the various transactions that Bashar al-Assad has maintained with ISIS, which, by the way, is hardly surprising. This is what happens in these kinds of conflicts. A lot of people do pragmatic transactions. In this case, economic oil sales and gas sales that he was getting from ISIS to his areas. And the middleman that was handling these transactions and paying the money and facilitating it was a Greek Catholic Christian who was just recently designated by the European Union as an entity for his role in this transaction, basically. So again, I was just to while we rightly think about with concern about what to do with this heritage in the Middle East that ensures its diversity and its sort of a culture of tolerance, hopefully down the road, is that we don't lose sight also of how it fits into the broader political scene and how the United States, as it crafts policy to address it, should take all these things into consideration.
Thanks, Tony. Brian, let me turn to you quickly. You've done this very important study on the condition of various Christian communities in the Middle East, and I know they're not all similarly situated. There's quite a diversity, but I wonder if you can just, in a couple of minutes, give us kind of the top lines of what you found in that study. Thank
you, John, and maybe I'll also build on something Tony just said there, too. It's really a great pleasure to be back here at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The work that this organization does and that you do is terribly important, especially now, in terms of promoting democratic values and fighting those ideologies that feed extremism. It's very important, and I know personally my own work, my thinking has been stimulated by the work that you produce. I don't always agree with the recommendations or bottom lines at times, but I think this focus on values and what we stand for, unfortunately in some circles has become passé, and or seen to be as such. And to me, I think it's at the core of the challenge. If you look at what's going on not only in the Middle East, but globally, and just one point globally, is that essentially over the last 8 or 9 years, you've seen a stalling of the spread of freedom and democracy. The third wave of democracy that academics called, the third wave from 1973 till about 2006, where there was a spread and uptick in that. And I raise that now, essentially the last 8 or 9 years, has been tough in that broader fight for freedom and democracy, and it connects directly with this issue of pluralism and tolerance in the report that we wrote on Christians in the Middle East. We did that in part because it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. More than 20 years ago when I lived in the Holy Land in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, I saw early sort of signs of something bigger going on. When I went to Iraq the first time in 2003, that which has happened, and Madam Representative has talked about, I saw early signs of worry among the Christian community. So, we approached it with great humility in the context of a lot of the research that we're doing in the region right now to try to understand. And what I thought I'd highlight is just 5 very quick points, a clinical analysis before we get into sort of what we do about it in the discussion. And some of these are pretty obvious, but I think it's important to set the table and the framework for thinking about a complicated issue. One is that the context and the environment matters quite a lot. And 2 things that stuck out for us was that what's going on in the Middle East right now, first, is part of a broader worrying historical trend. That a lot of what you see today, if you go back 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, you saw a different order that was collapsing, a regional order, an international order. And you saw also the decimation of Christian communities in certain parts. And I think that's important to understand because and as we note briefly in the report, understanding that context is very important because today's context, quite obviously, is a bitter struggle for power among the various actors in the region that have different ideologies that drive that power struggle. And in places like Iraq and especially Syria today, people are being crushed. Quite literally, communities. And the Christians we wanted to highlight in part, not because we're crusaders or anything like this, but because I have an avowed belief in just the humanity and the decency of ordinary folks. So the first is that the context matters and that what we've seen over the last 10 years is part of this broader stream of what's been happening in the region. The second is that the status of Christians varies substantially. From country to country, and we put copies of the report back there, I think, and I hope you take it. We have a brief and very brief section. The initial report was much longer, but the second point being that Egypt is quite different, obviously, than Lebanon or Iraq and Syria. The power dynamics are very different. Something Tony said was very important about politics, that these are communities, even though they identify as communities of faith, are very much engaged in the internal politics of each of the countries. So what does that mean when we get to how you approach this? You cannot have a cookie-cutter approach to the challenges, that this is very much connected not only to a regional power struggle, but the struggle for freedom and democracy and basic rights within countries. And it's different in Egypt. We have varying interpretations of what's happening in Egypt today. And our interviews with Christians of Egypt last fall indicate that there is a heck of a lot of nuance, even amongst the Christians of Egypt, about the current powers that be. The third, and this is a theme that sort of stretched through from Iraq, when we went to Iraq, to Jordan, all around the region, is that if there's one desire, there is a common desire for equality of citizenship, which in some ways the frame for this panel, I understand, is minorities. But I wanted to gently push back against that there were a lot of people in the series of interviews that we did not want to be viewed as such. So Egyptian Christians saying, hey, we're Egyptian. We happen to be Christian. Iraqis saying the same, even though they've been just run out of their communities in which their families had lived for generations. But this notion of that they wanted to have full citizenship in all sense of the word, in law, in society, and other things, an aspiration. And it's something I think we should keep in mind. The fourth, and I think this is obvious as well, but the radical ideologies that are driving a lot of the actors, whether they're Shia Muslim or Sunni Muslims, is at the core of this. And I think when you raise that, and I saw bits of the previous panels, people tend to focus on non-state actors, and that's correct. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, I mean, it's so obvious that they're crucifying Christians and other minorities and Yazidis. But the other thing I'd highlight is that there are state actors within the region and that have radical ideologies. And some of them happen to be our best friends sometimes on certain issues. Or some of them, there's, in my view, a pragmatic need to engage them diplomatically on certain issues like the nuclear issue, which presents for a challenging, when you get to what do you do about this and how to elevate it. And then the last thing I'd say, again, to paint a picture of what's going on here, is connect it to the historical struggle, the power struggles that are happening right now. There is a deficit of just strong institutions. Those institutions of rule of law, institutions of justice and the police and things like this, even in those societies that have relative stability right now. Egypt has a little bit more relative stability, of course, than Syria. But even in those places, there are deep pockets where all sorts of Egyptians, especially Christians, to this day, don't feel as safe as they could be because there isn't necessarily the protections and well-functioning institutions that are there. I know that a lot of that sounds anodyne. I think clinically, though, as an analysis, there are very big trends going on here. It connects to this broader struggle for freedom and the fight against authoritarianism, the struggle against radical ideologies, and lo and behold, more than almost 15 years after 9/11, the United States this past couple of months seems to have rediscovered the battle of ideas. The White House held a Countering Violent Extremism conference, which it's unclear to me what the follow-up to all of that is. But my main point is that battle of ideas is not a soft power thing. It's not something that should be pushed to the side. It's something like this issue of religious groups like Christians in the Middle East that need to be more deftly integrated into our overall engagement strategies in the Middle East. And we'll talk about what we do about it, but that was the picture of what we saw.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Irwin, I want to go to you quickly because, as Brian alluded to, these non-state actors are a real problem, but there is another major state in the region that we are dealing with, have a number of issues with and threats emanating from the state of Iran. But much overlooked oftentimes in that debate is the human rights situation in Iran and specifically the threat to minorities there. And I wonder if you can sort of give us a snapshot of that as quickly as you can.
Yes, I do. At first, I'd like to just echo Brian's words and also expressing my appreciation to FDD, to yourself, to Tony, all those associated with it, because we in the Canadian Parliament, and I would say the Canadian people, have been the beneficiaries, of FDD's work over the years. Also, something else that you mentioned, John, your introductory remarks, that this is going to be the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. This evening I have to return to Canada because we're going to be marking a National Holocaust Remembrance Day in Canada. But something earlier this month, we have established in the Canadian Parliament a National Day of Reflection on the Prevention of Genocide to be marked every April 7th in remembrance in particular of the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. And I'm mentioning that because I think there's a lesson here. What makes the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda so unspeakable is not only the horror of the genocide itself. That, of course, would be bad enough. But what makes it so unspeakable is that this genocide was preventable. Nobody could say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as nobody can say, frankly, with regard to Syria, that we did not know. It's a little over 4 years since that peaceful protest began. And when the protesters were gunned down, and from that we went to the Assad's scorched earth policy. And those of us at the time who recommended that under the R2P doctrine, we intervened to protect the civilians in Syria. We're told, well, if you intervene, this will lead to sectarianism, to civil war, to jihadism. All the things we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we did not intervene. When I say intervention, I'm referring to things like a no-fly zone, etc., the kind of protective initiative. But let me get to the question now of Iran. I think that Khamenei's Iran, and I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise the targets of massive domestic repression, is really the mother of state-sanctioned terrorism and jihadism, whose footprints and fingerprints, underpin whether it be the Shiite Hezbollah in Lebanon or whether it be the Sunni Muslims in terms of Hamas in Gaza, or whether it be the Houthi in Yemen, or became the enablers for Syria. One can go on and on. But what I want to focus on, as you put it, John, is and what is often marginalized, ignored, or even sanitized, is the massive domestic repression of human rights in general, and the targeting of minorities in particular in Iran, which have not only continued unabated under the moderate Rouhani's presidency, but have actually intensified under the charm offensive of Rouhani. Indeed, this massive domestic repression should have, and still should, inform and engage the nuclear negotiation. Just two considerations to share with you. First, the prospect of a massive rights-violating regime like Iran possessing a nuclear weapon or a threshold breakout state is itself sufficient to warrant a concern. The second thing is that the reality of Iran's repression and the breaches of its international law commitments should cause us, at the very least, to question the validity, if not veracity, of Iran's commitments with respect to the nuclear negotiations. But let me just, and with this I'll move to a close, just briefly summarize what I meant when I said about a massive domestic repression in Khamenei's Iran and the corresponding defiance of its international legal obligations, the whole amidst a culture of impunity which is ongoing and is ignored. First of all, let me begin with the dramatic increase in wanton executions in Iran, many of which target religious and ethnic minorities. It needs to be better known that not only does Iran execute more people per capita than any other country in the world, but in fact, in the first 3 months of 2015, over 200 have been executed, and that's those that we know about, which is the largest rate of execution that we have seen in Iran in 15 years. A second concern that warrants our involvement, and that is the culture of impunity in Iran. It was Rouhani, because we're now at the 27th anniversary of the massive killing of Iranian dissidents in 1988 in Iran. What is not that well known is that the person who presided over those killings was someone by the name of Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, who was appointed by Rouhani to be the Minister of Justice in Iran. What more outrageous expression of the culture of impunity can you have than the appointment of somebody who presided over the mass killings to then become the Minister of Justice? This is not even to mention 9 ministries that are under the direct authority of Rouhani that also engage not only in a culture of impunity, but as part of the culture of repression, whether it be the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Intelligence, etc. A third thing, and this is the United Nations Special Rapporteur in Iran, Ahmed Shahid, has pointed out, that there continues to be a persistent and pervasive torture, physical and psychological, that continues in Iran, particularly in the prison. The fourth is political prisoners. Yes, we've had some celebrated releases that we need to welcome, like Nasrin Sotoudeh, usually at an appropriate moment in the charm offensive. But what we should not forget is that you still have 1,000 political prisoners in Iran that cut across the leadership of Iranian civil society. In other words, human rights defenders, lawyers who would defend them, journalists, bloggers, educators, artists, trade union leaders, and the like. A massive repression of all the leadership of civil society in Iran. The next would be and the fifth would be the particular, and I move to a close, the particular persecution of the Baha'i. It's regrettable that we don't even appreciate that in 2014 was the largest and most dramatic increase of state-sanctioned incitement to hate against the Baha'i than in all the years. You had a tenfold increase in state-sanctioned incitement against the Baha'i, who not only are denied rights as citizens, but who are referred to by the leadership in Iran as not deserving even of any rights, as heretics and so on. And still the 7 imprisoned leaders in Iran, their imprisonment and their torture in detention continues, their 20-year sentence being a virtual death sentence, and all this goes unacknowledged and unaddressed. And finally, to close, the other targeted minorities in Iran, whether they be the Kurds, whether they be the Awazi Arabs, whether they be Christians in Iran, I can go on, a massive domestic repression that in particular targets ethnic and religious minorities, that should serve as a wake-up call to the international community and to American foreign policy, that when you're dealing with Iran on the nuclear issue, you cannot ignore or marginalize, let alone sanitize, the massive domestic repression.
Great, thank you, Irwin. Thank you. We're very short on time. We've got to go to. I'm going to try and get questions in groups of 3s. There are mics out there. Please identify yourself. Really, just questions, not statements. We haven't even gotten to the issue of what do we do about this. I'm always reminded of how Stalin responded when he was told that his repression of Catholics in the Soviet Union might be provoking the Pope. He said, "The Pope, how many divisions does he have?" And just obviously proceeded with his massive repression. So one question, what do we do about this? I'm going to go to this lady right there. Wait for the mic, please. Then the gentleman next to you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm Maryam Memar Sadeghi from Tavana, an e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. My question, to tie the last panel to this one, with the negotiations, the nuclear negotiations with Iran, and perhaps Mr. Cotler can speak to this in particular, why do you think that we didn't tie the human rights issues in, and particularly the treatment of minorities? During the Cold War era, when Reagan sat down with Gorbachev, he took every opportunity as one where he could put everything out on the table, all the reasons why our values, not just our military and political system, but our moral values are superior, and he pressed for the release of dissidents, and he talked about.
Okay, so why aren't we doing that in this case? Next to you, please. There's a gentleman right next to you.
Thomas McCabe, former DOD. One point. First off, since much of what is considered modern Islam is probably actually more accurately considered nonviolent radical Islam, and considering that that's most of the opposition in the Middle East today, my question is this: are we seeing a generalized radicalization of the Middle East population like we saw in Europe after the First World War, which made people much more accepting of extreme solutions?
Okay, thank you. I'm actually now going to go. Irwin, can you answer that first question, please? Brian, can you take that second one?
Yeah, on the first issue, I think that was a fatal error not to link the two. As you mentioned, with regard to Reagan and Gorbachev, when the arms control agreement was being negotiated, the U.S. administration did not say, okay, we're going to forget about the plight of Soviet Jews, we're going to forget about political prisoners in Iran. There was, in fact, the negotiation and adoption this year will be the 40th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, and the important human rights dimensions and the linkages in that Helsinki Final Act of security, economics, and human rights. We need to get back to that kind of integrated thinking and strategy in that regard. In fact, parenthetically, because John asked the question, but not unimportantly, in terms of what we can do about it.
We're very quick, Irwin.
We're going to be holding our 4th annual Iran Accountability Week in the Canadian Parliament, where we focus on 3 things. The Iranian fourfold threat, nuclear incitement, terrorist, and in particular, massive domestic repression. 2, a global Iranian political prisoner advocacy project where MPs take up the cases of political prisoners. And 3, the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator, of which we need to do more, and sanctioning those human rights violators.
Not for nothing that some people look to Irwin and Canada as the leaders of the free world. There's a lot of truth to that. Brian, on the...
Yeah, it's an important question, Thomas, and I think you're onto something, that there has been sort of this spread of ideological thinking, and it's in part the structure of the region and the sharing of ideas. The two things I'd say that are different compared to Europe post-World War I. One, in Europe in the previous century, essentially you had totalitarian ideologies that actually organized million-man armies that killed literally tens of millions of people. In the Middle East today, the story is more of fragmentation, of non-state actors actually being, and I hate the word because it sounds positive, entrepreneurial, but they are sort of pushing their own ideas, but they're not as organized as it was before. If anything, it's much more complicated than Europe and harder to deal with. The second thing is I would think the big wild card is the next generation. I wouldn't agree with any analyst who says it's going one way or the other. I just spent a lot of time with a new group of Egyptians who are very much anti-Islamist, but also skeptical, I think, of the current powers that be. So what you see is a region where the vast majority of the population is under the age of 25. 60% of Iraqis were born after 1990 and don't really even remember Saddam Hussein. So hopefully, and this is what I'll close here, why I think FDD's work and the work of putting values in democracy is terribly important, is that in the Middle East right now, as grim as it seems today, I actually think there are signs of hope, and some of that comes in these contact with the next generation, which is why I think putting things like human rights in Iran in the dialogue is terribly important, because these societies, I see structurally, are inevitably going to change, and hopefully for the better and towards our interests and values.
Okay, I've just got one. I'm going to do one lightning round, one just yes or no answer to really personalize this. If you had a relative, a Christian in Syria, Iraq, with an opportunity to get out to the West, would you tell them go or don't go? Brian.
No, I'd say go to Jordan or Kurdistan.
No question. I'll tell them to go.
Get out.
Yep.
Same thing.
Get out.
Come to Kurdistan.